Pastor Michael had been cleaning out the old filing cabinet in his office when his fingers brushed against something unusual. Behind the drawer, wedged in a space that seemed deliberately hidden, was a small wooden box. His heart skipped as he carefully extracted it, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through his office window. The box was worn smooth, as if handled countless times by gentle hands. Inside, he found what would change everything he thought he knew about his congregation. Hundreds of receipts, meticulously organized with paper clips and small handwritten notes. His hands trembled as he read the first one. Grocery bill for the Johnson family, $127.43, anonymous donation. The note was in neat handwriting he didn't recognize. He picked up another. Electric bill for Mrs. Patterson, $89.22, with love. Then another. School supplies for the Martinez children, $156.78. God provides. Receipt after receipt, all marked with the same careful handwriting, all documenting payments made on behalf of struggling church members. Medical bills, rent payments, car repairs, utility bills. The scope was breathtaking. But there was no signature, no name, just that consistent, loving script and the word anonymous repeated like a prayer. Pastor Michael sank into his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him. For 3 years, he had watched his congregation struggle through financial hardships, had prayed with families facing eviction, had counseled members drowning in medical debt. Yet somehow, miraculously, crisis after crisis had been averted. Bills had been mysteriously paid. Families had been saved from disaster. He had attributed it to divine intervention, to the mysterious ways God provided for his people. He had never imagined that God's provision might have come through one of his own children, working silently in the shadows. The receipts told a story that spanned years. Pastor Michael spread them across his desk, creating a timeline that revealed the depth of someone's extraordinary generosity. The earliest receipt was dated 4 years ago, a modest grocery bill for a family he remembered facing unemployment. The most recent was from just last week. What struck him wasn't just the money, though the amounts were staggering when added together, but the intimate knowledge these payments revealed. The anonymous giver knew when elderly Mrs. Chen couldn't afford her heart medication. They knew when young Tommy Rodriguez needed new glasses for school. They knew when the Wilsons' car broke down and they had no way to get to work. This wasn't random charity. This was someone who paid attention, who noticed the small struggles that people often tried to hide. Someone who saw Mrs. Patterson's embarrassment when she mentioned her electricity might be cut off. Someone who heard the catch in Mr. Johnson's voice when he talked about choosing between groceries and his daughter's asthma medication. Each receipt came with evidence of careful planning. The payments were always made directly to vendors, never as cash that might create awkwardness or obligation. Medical bills were paid to hospitals and pharmacies. Rent money went straight to landlords. Utility payments were made over the phone or online. The anonymous benefactor had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure their recipients never felt the burden of debt or the shame of knowing who had helped them. Pastor Michael realized he was looking at more than generosity. This was love in action, the kind of pure, selfless love that Scripture spoke of, but that he rarely witnessed so completely. Someone in his congregation had been living as a true disciple, giving not just money but dignity, privacy, and hope to their neighbors. Pastor Michael knew he couldn't let this mystery remain unsolved. Armed with the receipts and a growing sense of reverence, he began his investigation carefully. He started with the vendors, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the utility companies, anyone who might remember the person making these payments. At Miller's grocery store, the manager, Janet, remembered immediately when he described the situation. Oh yes, the quiet Asian lady who always paid in cash. she said with a warm smile. She'd come in with a list of account numbers and pay other people's tabs. Never wanted recognition, always insisted we not mention her name. She said it was between her and God. The pharmacy tech at CVS had similar memories. She'd come in every month like clockwork, sometimes more often, always had exact change, always had a list of prescription numbers. We offered to set up automatic payments for her, but she insisted on coming in person, said she needed to know the prayers were needed. At the electric company, the customer service representative pulled up records that painted an even clearer picture. She'd call and identify herself only as a friend of the family. We couldn't legally tell her account balances, but she seemed to know exactly how much was owed. She'd pay by credit card over the phone, but she must have gotten the information somehow. The pattern was becoming clear, but Pastor Michael still didn't know who this angel was. The descriptions were consistent. A quiet Asian woman, middle-aged, soft-spoken, who always wore simple clothes and carried an old leather purse. She never sought attention or thanks. She simply paid what was needed and left as quietly as she had come. But who was she? And how had she managed to help so many families while keeping her identity secret from everyone, including him? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow whose electric bill had been mysteriously paid multiple times, stopped by the church office that Thursday afternoon. She was carrying a small potted plant and wearing a confused expression. "Pastor Michael," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't think I'm being nosy, but I've been wondering about something for months now." She set the plant on his desk and fidgeted with her purse strap. "My electric bill keeps getting paid, and I know it's not the church's assistance fund because you told me that was empty last winter." Pastor Michael's pulse quickened. "What makes you think that, Mrs. Patterson?" "Well, I called the company to check my balance last month, and the lady on the phone let something slip. She said, 'Oh yes, Sarah always takes care of your account.' When I asked who Sarah was, she got all flustered and said she wasn't supposed to say names." Sarah. Finally, a name. Pastor Michael's mind raced through his congregation, thinking of every Sarah he knew. But then Mrs. Patterson continued, and her next words made everything click into place. "The funny thing is, I can only think of one Sarah who would know about my troubles. Sarah Chen, you know, the quiet lady who sits in the back left pew every Sunday. She was the one who noticed when I mentioned my electricity troubles to the ladies' auxiliary. She asked me such detailed questions about it, said she was praying for me, Sarah Chen. Of course, the woman who arrived early and left quietly, who never spoke during prayer requests but always seemed to be listening intently. The woman who worked as a bookkeeper at the medical center and would have access to information about community struggles. The woman whose eyes always held such compassion. Pastor Michael felt his world shift as Mrs. Patterson's words sank in. Sarah Chen, the woman he had barely noticed in 3 years of ministry, who sat quietly in the back pew and never drew attention to herself. He realized with a start that he knew almost nothing about her, despite her faithful attendance. After Mrs. Patterson left, he pulled out the church directory and found Sarah's information. Widowed 5 years ago, worked as a bookkeeper at Valley Medical Center, lived alone in a modest apartment on Elm Street, no emergency contact listed beyond a distant cousin in another state. The pieces began falling into place with stunning clarity. Her job at the medical center would give her insight into families struggling with medical bills. Her quiet presence at church functions would allow her to overhear conversations about financial troubles. Her bookkeeping skills would make her adept at navigating payment systems and managing multiple accounts. But what struck him most was the realization of how invisible she had made herself. In his 3 years at the church, he had never had a meaningful conversation with Sarah. She didn't serve on committees, didn't volunteer for events, didn't make prayer requests. She simply showed up, worshipped quietly, and disappeared. Now he understood that her absence from church leadership wasn't apathy, it was strategy. She couldn't risk being too visible, couldn't afford to have people know her well enough to suspect what she was doing. Her entire church experience had been shaped around her secret mission of mercy. The magnitude of her sacrifice began to dawn on him. This wasn't just about money, though he was certain she had given tens of thousands of dollars over the years. This was about a woman who had chosen to live in the shadows so that others could step into the light. The following Sunday, Pastor Michael watched Sarah Chen with new eyes. She arrived 15 minutes early, as always, carrying her worn leather purse and a small Bible. She nodded politely to other members, but didn't linger in conversation. She took her usual seat in the back left pew, 3 rows from the exit. During his sermon about the widow's mite, he found himself looking directly at her. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, but he noticed something he had missed before, the careful attention in her eyes, the way she seemed to catalogue every prayer request and community need that was mentioned. After the service, as the congregation filed out, Pastor Michael made his move. "Sarah," he called softly, approaching her pew, "would you mind staying for a moment? I'd like to speak with you." For just an instant, he saw something flicker across her face, fear perhaps, or resignation. But she nodded and remained seated while the church emptied around them. When they were alone, Pastor Michael sat down beside her. He pulled out the wooden box and placed it gently on the pew between them. Sarah's face went completely pale. "I found these while cleaning out the office," he said quietly. 4 years of receipts, 4 years of answered prayers that I thought were miracles." He paused, studying her face. "They were miracles, weren't they? Just not the kind I expected." Sarah's composure cracked like fragile glass. Her hands shook as she reached for the box, and tears began streaming down her face. "I never meant for anyone to find out," she whispered. I couldn't stand watching people suffer when I could help. The dam had broken. The secret was finally out." Through her tears, Sarah's story emerged like water finding its way through stone. Her husband David had been a successful accountant before his death from cancer 5 years earlier. He had left her with a substantial life insurance policy and modest investments that provided her with more than enough to live on. "David always said money was just a tool," she whispered, clutching a tissue. "He made me promise that if something happened to him, I would use what he left me to make a difference. But I never expected it would become this." She had started small, she explained, a grocery bill here, a utility payment there. But as she integrated into the church community and began to understand the depth of need around her, her mission had grown. Her job at the medical center gave her insight into the health struggles of congregation members. Her bookkeeping skills allowed her to navigate complex payment systems and maintain anonymity. "I would see Mrs. Johnson at the pharmacy, counting out coins for her daughter's asthma medication," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "Or I would overhear Mr. Rodriguez telling someone his son needed glasses, but they couldn't afford them. These aren't strangers to me, Pastor. They're my church family." The most heartbreaking revelation came when she explained her isolation. "I couldn't get too close to anyone," she admitted. "I couldn't risk someone discovering what I was doing. People would either try to stop me, or they would feel obligated to me, and that would ruin everything. The whole point was that God was providing for them, not Sarah Chen." She had sacrificed relationships for the sake of her mission, choosing to love her community from a distance rather than risk exposing her secret. She had made herself invisible so that God's provision could remain visible. As Sarah's story unfolded, Pastor Michael began to understand the true cost of her generosity. It wasn't just the money, though he estimated she had given away nearly $60,000 over 4 years. It was the emotional and spiritual weight of carrying such a secret. "Do you know how many times I wanted to just walk up to families and write them a check?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "When I saw the Martinez children wearing shoes that were falling apart, when I watched Mrs. Patterson choose between groceries and medication, it would have been so much easier to just be direct." But she had learned that direct charity often created more problems than it solved. Pride, embarrassment, the burden of obligation, these could be as crushing as financial hardship itself. So she had developed an elaborate system of indirect giving that preserved dignity while meeting needs. "I had to become a detective," she said with a weak smile, learning which pharmacy filled whose prescriptions, which grocery stores gave credit to which families, which landlords were patient and which ones weren't. I had to know everyone's situation better than they thought anyone knew. The isolation had been the hardest part. I would sit in this pew every Sunday, listening to people share their struggles, knowing I could fix their problems, but having to stay silent. I would hear Thanksgiving prayers for mysteriously paid bills, and I had to act as surprised as everyone else. She paused, looking around the empty sanctuary. Sometimes I wondered if I was being foolish, if God really wanted me to live like this. But every time someone's crisis was averted, every time a family stayed in their home or a child got medical care they needed, I knew I was exactly where God wanted me to be. Pastor Michael knew he couldn't keep Sarah's secret indefinitely, but he also understood her desire for privacy. They agreed on a compromise. He would share her story with the congregation, but only after giving her time to prepare for the inevitable attention and gratitude that would follow. The following Sunday, Pastor Michael stood before his congregation with tears in his eyes and the wooden box in his hands. He told them about his discovery, about the mystery benefactor who had been walking among them for years, about the hundreds of bills paid and crises averted through one person's extraordinary generosity. When he revealed that their guardian angel had been Sarah Chen, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Heads turned toward the back left pew, where Sarah sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, tears streaming down her face. The congregation erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. But it was what happened after the applause that truly moved Pastor Michael. One by one, people began standing. Mrs. Johnson stood first, then Mr. Rodriguez, then Mrs. Patterson. Soon the entire congregation was on their feet, not just clapping, but weeping. "My daughter could have died without her asthma medication," Mrs. Johnson called out through her tears. "Sarah saved my child's life." "My family would have been homeless," added Mr. Martinez. "We were 3 days from eviction." The testimonies continued as people realized the scope of what Sarah had done. Medical treatments that saved lives, rent payments that kept families together, utility payments that kept homes warm in winter, car repairs that allowed people to keep their jobs. Sarah remained seated, overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude and love. This was exactly what she had tried to avoid, yet she found herself deeply moved by the realization that her secret had created something beautiful. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened to the congregation. Sarah's revelation had exposed the depth of need within their community, but it had also revealed the power of one person's committed love. Instead of simply thanking Sarah and moving on, the congregation began to transform. Inspired by Sarah's example, others began looking for ways to help quietly and effectively. A secret fund was established, not to replace Sarah's giving. She continued her mission with the community's blessing, but to multiply it. People began paying attention to each other in new ways, noticing struggles they had previously overlooked. Mrs. Patterson, whose electricity bills Sarah had paid, began delivering groceries to elderly members. The Rodriguez family started a tool library, sharing equipment with families who couldn't afford repairs. Mr. Johnson, whose daughter's medication had been covered, became a volunteer driver for medical appointments. Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. No longer needing to hide her mission, she became a consultant of sorts, helping others identify needs and find dignified ways to meet them. Her years of secret giving had made her an expert in compassionate intervention. "I thought I would hate having people know," Sarah told Pastor Michael one afternoon. "I was so afraid it would change everything, but it's changed everything in the most beautiful way possible." The church had discovered something profound. The woman who had seemed invisible had actually been the most visible person among them. Her quiet faithfulness, her careful attention to others' needs, her willingness to sacrifice recognition for effectiveness, these qualities had been shining all along for anyone who looked closely enough. Pastor Michael realized he had learned something essential about ministry. Sometimes the most powerful servants of God are the ones who work so quietly that only God sees them clearly. 6 months later, Pastor Michael stood in his office looking at a new wooden box, this one larger than the first, filled with receipts from multiple contributors. Sarah's revelation had started something that continued to grow and spread throughout the community. The original box now sat in a place of honor on his bookshelf, a reminder of the miracle he had witnessed. Sarah still sat in the back left pew every Sunday, but she was no longer invisible. Children waved to her, families stopped to chat, and she had become one of the most beloved members of the congregation. More importantly, she was no longer alone in her mission. The church had learned that God's provision often comes through God's people, and that the most effective charity is the kind that preserves dignity while meeting needs. They had discovered that love in action looks like Sarah Chen, quiet, consistent, and completely selfless. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found those receipts," Pastor Michael mused to Sarah one Sunday afternoon. They were sitting together in the sanctuary, watching families gather for the evening service. "God would have found another way," Sarah replied with certainty. "He always does. I was just his way for a little while. Now, he's using all of us." As Pastor Michael watched his congregation, people helping people, needs being met quietly and effectively, love being lived out in practical ways, he realized that Sarah's greatest gift hadn't been her money. It had been her example. She had shown them what it looks like to love without seeking credit, to give without expecting recognition, to serve without needing applause. The receipts had been important evidence, but the real miracle was still walking among them every Sunday, proof that angels sometimes choose the back pew and carry old leather purses and wooden boxes full of grace. Thank you for listening to this story of hidden grace and quiet love. It reminds us that the most powerful acts of faith often happen in the shadows, seen only by God until the moment He chooses to bring them to light. We'd love to know where you're listening to this story from. Please share your location in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring tales of faith, hope, and love in action. Remember, you never know when the quiet person sitting near you might be an angel in disguise, carrying receipts for grace and a heart full of secret generosity.